A lot of you have wanted me to do this list for quite a while. I mean, we've had equivalent lists for the Speccy and Amiga, not to mention the Mega Drive and Master System. It all feels a bit incomplete without having one for the C64, doesn't it? Almost like the bias towards the one I grew up with is showing again. But here we are. Having spent a good few years enjoying many a game on the C64, I feel confident enough to make a list of my favourites. Naturally, there's going to be plenty of debate, some games everyone's going to welcome, some games that may make people scratch their heads, and undoubtedly some omissions that will make people shout and rage. But I'm happy with what I've got down. It should be said here that, as alluded to, I didn't really grow up with the Commodore 64. My love for it came well after the fact, in adulthood. You may find that a lot of what I love on the platform is a bit more arcadey than what others enjoy. So for example, while the C64 definitely did bloody great in the world of RPGs, and certainly a hell of a lot better than the Spectrum did, it's hard for me to include games that I've never really touched, old RPGs from the 80s that would be a struggle for me to really get to grips with now. Still, this is undoubtedly a high quality top 50 indeed. Even if you may not agree with the order, I'm sure you'll agree with the standard of titles itself. Mostly anyway. With all that said then, let's just get on with it, shall we? The top 50 starts with a text adventure? I mean, if you've ever seen me try to play any of these games, you'll know that text adventures really aren't my thing at all. But Castle of Terror is one of the very few that I will accept. Why? Well, it uses some of the C64's natural advantages. It sure helps things when you've got a pretty bloody good soundtrack playing throughout the game as opposed to stony silence. The game itself is a pretty generic adventure about heading off to a castle to kill Dracula, which unfortunately you can't actually do thanks to a bug, but the music in particular, as well as the smooth way in which it's all done, means that for once this is a text adventure where I won't just start randomly inputting swear words into the parcel after a minute or so. Okay, this is probably the shoddiest of all the games in the top 50. Action Biker is a budget Mastertronic title that existed to tie in with A-tier prawn cocktail maze-based snack, Skips Crisps. I'm not sure what exactly the game itself has to do with Skips, but it's something of a guilty pleasure. It's just kind of fun to get on a bike and speed around without too much care and attention paid to the game's actual objectives. It's certainly a lot better than the Speccy game of the same name. Not necessarily a game that I would recommend, but one that I do have a soft spot for. Not every game has to be original. One look at Anthony Crowther's Blagger and you can see quite clearly just how much it's inspired by Manic Miner, hence the name perhaps. But then a whole load of microcomputer platformers were, so it doesn't really matter all that much. What does matter is that Blagger is one of the best made of all the Manic Miner type clones, with plenty of nicely constructed single screen levels to play with. A nice early gem from a top Commodore programmer. Summer Games is a more obvious entry into a top C64 list. You're kind of bound to see at least one or two of Epix's games make their way into any countdown, and not just because of the bloody awesome warm-up-your-hands neon outline artwork on the cover. Simple enough button basher lists may be, but it's jolly good at what it does. It was the first of many, and the opening ceremony is one of those weirdly iconic C64 moments. Speaking of iconic, I imagine a lot of people would have Beachhead higher up than this. An American game that also became a smash hit over here due to it being many people's introduction to the noble name of US Gold, it's essentially a compilation of atmospheric and very well done mini-games where you simply have to try and keep as many ships going as you can before taking it to the enemy with your cannons. To some it may just look like lines on a black screen, but if you've played it, you know it's a treacherous sea filled with lethal torpedoes that'll sink you the moment you put a foot one. Justifiably famous. An early gem from the brilliant Sean Southern, Trailblazer is probably the first game in the top 50 that you couldn't get anywhere else other than the C64 at the time. Other micros just couldn't move those lovely grid floors fast enough. An early demonstration of the war speed that Sean would later stick into the Lotus games, Trailblazer is a tricky game of moving a ball over many platforms and trying not to fall every 2 seconds. Usually I fail at that, but I enjoy the game anyways. Also very much an inspiration for the PC classic Skyroads, which is a big point in its favour. The second and final entry from Epix's Games on here, World Games is in many ways the one of the big four that never really escaped the Commodore. The ports for this one on the Master System and the like are especially terrible, unfortunately, whereas here on the Commodore you get a highly respectable amount of varied and generally well done events. I mean, there's not too many other places where you can experience the joys of log rolling, caber tossing, and even bull riding on the same package. On balance, this might be the best of all the games for me, just edging out California games on the Sega machines. Hard and Heavy is the first time we see German Masters Rainbow Arts appear on this list, and quite obviously it won't be the last. It's not necessarily one of their major games. Headed up by the late Armin Gessert, this is a platformer that is in many ways a remix and reskin of his much more famous and more controversial Great Giana Sisters, which we will be seeing later. We've got a nice robot who can fire on command, some pumping Chris Hulsbeck tunage, big old futuristic sheen, and difficulty. This game is certainly hard, make no mistake. But worth the challenge? Absolutely. Ocean Software's take on Rambo First Blood Part 2 is generally a pretty good time on the micros it came out on, but it is unquestionably most iconic on the C64. As fine as it is on the Spectrum, it's hard to beat actual backgrounds and a storming Martin Galway soundtrack. It's a more open world take on the classic Commando formula, in which our hero starts off with little more than his old friend Colonel James Bowie to deal with hordes of enemies, but gradually builds his arsenal to become the one-man army that you would expect. Quite the impulsive game this one, tricky blighter but fast and quick enough to encourage plenty, and I do mean plenty, of goes. Another absolute given in this list, Access's Leaderboard is a game that basically built a whole sports genre by itself. Just about every golf game made afterwards was heavily inspired by Leaderboard and its thoroughly natural power bar based golf swing mechanic. It's still not bad at all to play today, delivering the general relaxation you would expect from a nice little golf game. Even for someone like me who can barely hit the ball with a stick in real life, golf games are surprisingly addictive. And it's hard to imagine just what they would look like without the existence of Leaderboard. David Crane's legendary tie-in is playable on just about every 8-bit computer and console platform you can think of course, but for me Ghostbusters is best and most iconic on C64. You all know the drill. Build up your Ecto-1 and prowl New York City in search of spectres. Drive to the location, try not to cross the streams, and trap those ghosts without getting slimed. Do this and you'll successfully manage the city's PK energy and get a chance to enter the Zool building. Pretty repetitive of course, but satisfying here, whereas it's obviously terrible on something like the NES. That said, the most joy in this game may well be successfully timing presses of the space key on the title screen to get that digitised Ghostbusters squeal in time with the SID rendition of the iconic theme. Flying in all the way from 1983, Bob Polin's Blue Max is a weird early hybrid of arcade and simulation, in that most of the time will be spent flying around shooting down planes and trying to bomb buildings and enemy formations, but you've got to actually figure out how to take off first, and it's the sort of game where if you pirated it, you might give up in frustration before even doing that. See also Raid over Moscow and trying to get out of that bloody Hannah. I think you either enjoy this game or you don't, but I've always dug it. There's not much to the game, but it's very satisfying when you get a bomb just right and blow up your targets. Very easy to repeat over and over again too. It's a nice little early game. Sticking with shoot-em-ups, here's Uridium, another one of those iconic C64 titles where, even if versions of this game on other micros were actually really good, the Commodore one still stands above the rest. Graft Gold's game is essentially a take on Defender where you're flying above an enemy base, you destroy everything you can on the ground while dodging enemy fire up above, and do it all in a couple of minutes before you land and initiate the self-destruct sequence. It is famously brutally difficult, but the cocktail of brilliant sound effects and unbelievably quick action make this a quintessential game on the platform. In the grand scheme of things, Epix's Jumpman is probably a fair bit more influential on the platforming genre than the Manic Miner-esque platforms that tend to dominate my microcomputer lists, isn't it? It's certainly a faster game. Originally created as a home riff on Donkey Kong for the Atari 8-bits, it's still got a nice chunk of charm and playability despite being so old. And I think you can easily figure out by now that I'm a big fan of micro single-screen fun, can't you? Certainly this deserves a place here. Flimbo's Quest is the first appearance here for the almighty System 3. It's nowhere near the most famous of their C64 games, obviously, but it's a very cute platformer that I have a big soft spot for. It's fun to travel around the levels and find the monster that you've got to kill, just for the sake of getting a letter to a wizard. Cute platformers are often pretty barbaric if you think about them too hard, as it happens. The mechanic here allows for some tricky timing-based puzzles in later levels that you don't often see in games like this, and it's just fun to screw around in it. Pretty underrated, in all honesty. Manfred Trenz comes roaring into view with the game that brought him to the dance, Katakis, a thoroughly intense space shooter in a similar vein to the likes of R-Type and what have you, full of everything you would expect from a Rainbow Arts title. Technically it's simply got the best of everything, from cracking graphics to Chris Hulsbeck. Gameplay wise it's as much of a beefy challenge as any other vintage C64 shooter you care to mention. Manfred obviously likes his games to be tough as old boots, and this is no exception. It has to be said that horizontal shooters like this do often make specky owners like me cringe a bit, as good as some of the efforts on my favoured platform could be. I have previously covered the American port of Ikari Warriors in a video before now, because it's one of the most pathetic efforts at porting a game known to man. It certainly stands in stark contrast to this, the European version released by Elite and coded by a certain John Twiddy, aka the guy who went on to make The Last Ninja. This is a staggering effort, full of enemies, music, graphics, the lot. It's as close to the arcade as you're going to get on the MicroProse and deserves a hell of a lot of respect. I mean, I'm not even that big a fan of Ikari Warriors, but this is just an absolute stonker of a port. Cyberdyne Systems' Armorlight is a similar story to Katakis, only the R-Type influence here is even more apparent due to the endless tight nooks and crannies you have to squeeze your ship into. Smooth as you like, of course, and once again a great horizontal shooter you could only really experience here on the C64. Mind you, the Specky did get a half-decent demo back in the day, but the full game unfortunately never arrived. Armorlight is an absolute cracker, and the most famous game from these quite obscure code merchants. And now, here's Monty Mole. The two Monty games on this list are actually kind of unique. Gameplay and graphics wise, these versions of the game aren't all that different to what you see on the ZX Spectrum, and yet they are very much C64 titles first for me. The reason for that is kind of obvious. The glorious collaboration between Sid Meier's Rob Hubbard and Ben Daglish for the game's music just sounds so much better here on C64 than it does on Spectrum, and it's the perfect soundtrack to the mole's travels around exotic islands in pursuit of endless trinkets. Paradroid. Weird game this. I'm not sure I could fully explain how you actually play it. There's a lot of very weird complexities to the title, the sort of things you only really see on old British micro games. It's much the same story with the game's specky equivalent, the also fabulous Quasitron. But of these two brilliant Graft Gold titles, I'd pick Paradroid if I had to choose between them. The top-down view here is a bit more utilitarian compared to the isometrics of Quasitron, but it results in a faster and much more intense game where you're never quite sure just what's behind each and every door. Speaking of weird games, Law of the West kicks off the top 30. The accolade gem where you play as a sheriff and try to deal with various situations throughout the day, ideally with the use of dialogue and not your pistol. Of course, sometimes you may just have to draw down and, well, hopefully you don't end up lying on your back, dying in the sun either because the doctor's not in town, or you cussed him out earlier and he doesn't want to treat you. Law of the West is credited as the first game to use multiple choice dialogue options, and while it's a shame that it's so short, what's here is fantastic. World Class Leaderboard isn't all that different from the original Leaderboard, but well, it didn't need to be. It's enough to have this brilliant formula and take it to even more courses that now actually feel considerably more like the real deal in construction. It's just more of an aesthetic improvement, providing more of a challenge where the original's play areas could be a bit more basic, and that alone is enough to justify having this here, the last word from the first great name in golf games. Fuck off. I'll always go to bat for microcomputers because of the games on them that you just can't really get anywhere else. The ones that go all in on a weird idea, in ways that you don't always see as much on consoles. Space Taxi is one of those. You take the idea behind something like Joust and use it to pilot a ship through intricate areas, ferrying passengers from point A to point B. Leaving aside the iconic speech samples, the "Hey, taxis" and what have you, it's another computer gem that only needs a single screen for its levels, and that tight construction is just so appealing to me. There's not much like Space Taxi aside from games like Ugh, which essentially paid homage to it. R-Type is one of those arcade ports that's kind of a weird constant through all the major microcomputers. They all have their own charm. If the Spectrum version punches so highly above its weight, the Amiga version is classically definitive, and the newer Amstrad version is testament to what homebrew coders can pull off, the C64 version is a war exhibition of Sid and Vic2, Rainbow Arts flexing those Katakis muscles once more, with Trends and Hillspec going all out. The gameplay for me perhaps isn't quite at the level of the versions I just mentioned, but still, this is R-Type written large, with a big old C64 flavour. The Last Ninja's only at number 26? Right at the halfway point of the list? Really? Well, there's a couple of reasons. At the time, this was, of course, one hell of an achievement. The Last Ninja series is something you just can't get anywhere else, a showcase of all the things that make the C64 the fantastic gaming micro that it is. A lot of the time it doesn't play all that badly either. Lots of hunting around adventuring, either getting into fights or evading opponents. It's totally fine. Unfortunately, the decision to add all those bloody pixel-perfect jumping sequences over water, in an isometric game no less, kind of hurts the game a lot. It's no secret that Mark Cale regretted it later on, and it does hurt the original. Not to worry, mind you, there is obviously a greater sequel coming much later on. The true halfway point of the list sees us look at another game loved by C64 fans, and rightly so. Mayhem in Monsterland is one of those coup de grace titles for the Commodore. It came out as late as 1993 and serves as a final example of just how good the machine could be in the hands of those who could work it. It's an ultra-smooth Euro platformer that in almost every regard feels like it could be a 16-bit title. Not bad for a computer that was well over a decade old by this point. And for all the game's technical achievements, it doesn't skimp on gameplay either. It's more than engaging enough to provide a fine experience bouncing on enemies and collecting stars. In short, it's a very nice way to bid farewell to a legend. A platformer that's perhaps more famous and iconic does follow. Epyx's Impossible Mission. A simple enough game once you break it all down, I suppose. Why, you've just got to collect a bunch of puzzle pieces and put them together, haven't you? But then you add the robots, the computers, and realise how fiendish putting the puzzle together can actually be, as well as the game being a different layout every time you go for it, and well, the name is kind of appropriate. Staggeringly influential, obviously. Games that are an awful lot like Impossible Mission are still successful to this very day. But the original honestly hasn't been disturbed at all by time. It's absolutely got something. It may just make you want to stay a while. Stay forever! Because that's what the evil scientist says in the game, obviously. Much like The Last Ninja, System 3's original International Karate is great, but does have a much better sequel coming up. Not to mention another game that's very similar to it, but kind of manages to just be that little bit better. The development of the game itself is quite the revelation. It's a wonder it ever came out at all. It was a disaster zone for most of its development, and you only need to look at the game on the Spectrum to see just how it could have turned out. Thankfully, Archer McLean stepped in on the C64 to sort things out and bring this game home. Is it a lot like Way of the Exploding Fist? Yes, but it lays the groundwork for something that's going to fully eclipse both. It says a lot about Jeff Minter when this early game of his, a title that's all about stealing someone's mower and cutting your grass while they chase you about, or while you try and manage an overeager dog's loyalty and tolerance and avoid flowers, is one of his more staid and conservative titles. But this was many people's introduction to the man's brilliant mind, and it's still one of the best games made out of a thoroughly mundane chore. A little bit like Kicks, a bit like his own Grid Runner, and a bit, well, just a lot Jeff Minter. There's no one else like him. The series of introductions to British software legends continues with MicroProse Soccer, our first look at the almighty Sensible Software. Drops and Quicks would obviously make a far more famous footy game later on, but this is great for their first shot, especially when it's got so many cool touches from the inclusion of indoor football to the massively influential aftertouch and even the silly details on the instant replays. It's Sensi's musical approach to game design written all over, even in a simple football game that they can't help but fill with fine little flourishes. The first thing most people mention about Barbarian is that somewhat raunchy Maria Whittaker and Wolf from Gladiators based cover, and while that's famous, it kind of ignores just how good the game actually is. It's another one-on-one fighter that just works on the C64, and more than just being international karate only with muscles and swords, it does have something special in that one great equaliser. You can be all the way down in a fight, almost to the brink of death, but you're never more than one hit away from victory. When a perfectly executed Conan-esque spinning slash lops the head off of your opponent's shoulder for the lizard to kick off screen as they laugh and drag your poor enemy's body away, well, that's got to be one of the most satisfying things in all of C64 gaming, surely. Number 19 takes us to the world of Cosme and the mind of Paul Norman, one of the first people out there who really tried to do something more cinematic in the world of games. His first title, Forbidden Forest, is probably his most famous, but my heart's always been with his second, Aztec Challenge. It's a collection of fairly simple minigames, and a lot of folk may never even see past the initial and still quite impressive gauntlet, but something about it just keeps me persevering. The music, which Norman composed himself, has a lot to do with it, probably one of the first great examples of what the SID can do. A build-up of quiet tribal drums getting ever louder before culminating in a brutal, crunchy riff as you get further and further in each level. On the whole, not bloody bad for 1983. Turrican is another shoo-in for this list, obviously. While I've undoubtedly played the game on Amiga more than any other platform, it is a C64 original. Manfred Trenzer's shoot-or-die-rific side-scroller is, I suppose, more evidence for just how advanced C64 games had gotten by the dawn of the 1990s. They'd come a long way. It's a shame that the C64 version largely doesn't have too much music, but the sounds are quality in any case, and the gameplay may have a slight edge over the 16-bit versions of the title. Either way, you've got crazily large stages full of secrets and an all-conquering hero with tons of powers at his disposal. It's everything you would want in a 16-bit game of this type, only in 8 bits. Awesome. Who doesn't enjoy a lovely bit of running around, making your way through piles and piles of sand, collecting gems and avoiding getting thoroughly stroffed in the head by rocks? Many games followed this formula in the Micro era, but the original Boulder Dash is still probably the best example out there. There's not all that much to it really. It's such a simple little game, but those tight time limits are enough to make you rush around and potentially make mistakes. Just as it's satisfying to breeze through a level in double quick time, few things make you feel quite as foolish as screwing everything up and trapping yourself in, leaving no other option aside from self-destruction. You just gotta strike the right balance. So many games back in the day tried to take the classic formula of Defender and do something different with it, with varying degrees of success. While some were geniuses, some went too far away from the classic and kind of forgot what made it so great in the first place. Arch McLean's Dropzone doesn't forget that, but it adds the element of gravity and it's kind of a game changer, making the fight between man and alien all the more tricky and intense. The C64 is more than capable of providing the necessary arcade bombast to seal the deal and make this an absolutely bloody awesome product. A definite UK arcade classic, beautifully done in the home. Gremlin's Boulder is many things. Wonderfully kooky, uniquely British, brutally hard and frustrating, and addictive as all hell. I could probably spend a good time here shouting at the game for some of its more fiendish foibles, especially the random placing of your ball when you die that more often than not will put you in virtually impossible situations, and yet when death inevitably comes I'll still immediately click the button for another go 9 times out of 10. Chris Strigley loved to do these kooky and silly games, but this is definitely his best marriage of that strangeness with some wonderful gameplay, and for all the annoyance I really do love it still. International Karate was good, but obviously it wouldn't have existed without the Way of the Exploding Fist, and for me, this game's that little bit better. In both titles you get a thoroughly intense minute or so of fighting, both you and the opponent trying to find your range and land a very satisfying punch or kick that'll net you either a half or full point. Some people look at awful things like the MicroProse attempts at Street Fighter 2 and wonder how anyone could enjoy a fighting game that's only got one button, but the likes of Fist show just how bloody good it can actually be. Even if fighting games certainly got more advanced, this is still excellent. Another C64 game that had its origin on the Atari 8-bits, Montezuma's Revenge is another great early platformer. Robert Yeager's title was one of the first to do away with fully contained single-screen levels and give you a whole pyramid to explore, with plenty of jewels and keys to find that will take you further and further down until you reach the treasure chamber. It may be one of the first of its kind, but the speed of the game, which is always kind of a big thing for me in platformers, still makes it a ton of fun to play. Even the silly little jingle that plays whenever Panama Joe collects anything brings a big old smile to my face, it has to be said. There is something very gratifying when an 8-bit micro arcade port doesn't only match, but surpasses the arcade original. It doesn't happen often, but it's bloody good when it does happen, and Commando on C64 is one of the examples. I mean, it's not like the original Commando's bad, in fact it's great. But this, with all the gameplay intact, plus Rob Hubbard's all-time legendary soundtrack? Sorry, but this is the first thing I think of whenever Commando comes up. A legendary top-down shooter that you can just blitz through if you want to, complete with all that lovely SID crunch. Continuing in kind of a similar vein, Bubble Bobble is kind of just great everywhere. Arcade Original, Specky, Amiga, NES, and here on C64. There's not a whole lot you can say wrong with it, really, and while you perhaps couldn't say this time that the microcomputer versions beat the original, it is pretty much on the same level. The game rules wherever you go, simple as that. There's all the enemies and all the bubbles waiting to be popped, not to mention one of the catchiest songs in video game history. It is quite obviously one of the most iconic games of them all. This port thankfully gives it all the respect that it's due. If you're going to play it on C64, this is going to do very nicely indeed. The top 10 is here, and we start off pretty damn strong with Last Ninja 2. And as loved as the original was, there was no doubt that the sequel improved on it in basically every way, in more than just not having any bloody pixel perfect jumping sequences. It's kind of a bold step to take Armor Cooney and send him travelling through time to contemporary New York City, but it just adds to this game's cinematic ambition, and it nails those better than just about any other C64 game that tried to pull it off. Annoyances from the original have generally been smoothed out, it's gorgeous to look at, and I mean, look, as much as I sound like a broken record talking about a C64 game's great music, just listen to this frickin' amazing thing. What music? And what a game. The first official game to come out under the Sensible Software label is just so underrated. People really do tend to forget Parallax in Sensi's incredible library. They started with a simple enough top-down shooter, but then kept running with it until they had a big open-world area where you get in and out of the ship, find scientists and cards, manage your supplies, all to solve a big overarching puzzle. It's so clear, right from the off, how much of a talent these two young musicians had for taking the way they put songs together and applying it to game design. Drops and Quicks were quite simply geniuses. Monty Mole's only gone and stuck his head out again, hasn't he? It wouldn't really be a micro-based list without one classic example of the slow and exacting micro-platformer, just as originated by Matthew Smith. But this is, of course, Peter Harrop's creation, and the third instalment of Monty Mole's adventures is by far the best of them. It may be evil at points, especially with those random bloody crushers and traps disguised as collectibles, but it is still awesome. And yes, it does have what is probably the definitive piece of Commodore 64 music as its soundtrack, a song by Rob Hubbard that's kind of transcended the game and the platform, to the point where many people would recognise it despite never actually having played Monty on the One. But they should, because the game that the music accompanies is a perfect complement to it. Turrican 2 is an odd thing. It came out in 1991, and normally it probably wouldn't have existed at all on C64. It certainly would have made more sense to just put the game out on Amiga, wouldn't it? But Manfred Trenz loved the C64 so much, so he kind of insisted even if he'd have to basically do the whole thing himself. And as Turrican is his baby, he considers the C64 version to be the original Turrican 2, even if it ended up coming out after the Amiga game. Bren McGuire's tale of revenge against the machine is, again, just as good on the 8-bit as it is on the 16-bit in every area except music, although the C64's occasional bits of tunage are naturally excellent. The same brilliance as the original, only bigger and better, and a great way for Trenz to sign off on the microcomputer that he dearly loved. If there is one thing that I love in a puzzle game, it's the ability to tinker, to be given a task and tweak little bits here and there in order to get the solution. And few games satisfy that urge quite like Deflector, which is for me one of the very best puzzlers ever created. More people really should know the name of Costa Panayi, it has to be said. The man made some of the absolute best 8-bit games, from Highway Encounter to Hate, but this is definitely his peak. And it does, of course, feature what I believe to be the signature song of one of the best to ever work the SID, the sadly departed and much missed Ben Daglish. Cowbell and all. If you haven't ever played Deflector, you're seriously missing out on a classic. Here is kind of an odd one to kick off the top 5. For all the brilliant games that I've featured from Rainbow Arts, here's my top pick from them. And it's the one that in many ways is a homage to Super Mario Bros. So much so that Nintendo sued and got the game removed from the shelves. Some may well scream at this being ahead of the likes of Turrican, but I can't help it. I absolutely love this. It may not be all that original, but that music, the lovely characters, the obviously amazing playability, and even the slight touches that do separate it at least a little bit from those two famous plumbers. Would I go as far as to say that the Great Giana Sisters is better than Super Mario Bros? Okay, I probably wouldn't, but I still think it's marvellous. Most licensed game tie-ins were generic as all hell, and there were a lot of them. Ocean were responsible for a lot of those, of course, the good, bad and mediocre. And even if it became a bit of an old meme for them to make these tie-ins, they did actually hit the mark quite often. But Frankie Goes to Hollywood is something else entirely. A tie-in that isn't just about a band, but more about an ideal, whatever it was that Frankie represented back in their pomp. That's what ZTT wanted from a Frankie game, and developers Denton Designs utterly nailed it. It could have easily been something stupid and shallow, like if it was just the mini-games you played or whatever. but instead these games are just one part of a fully featured adventure where you search for both the Pleasure Dome and for yourself, your quest to become a real person, as the game says. It is as 80s as it gets, more so than anything else here perhaps, but there is nothing really like it, certainly not when it comes to tie-in games, and as such it is absolutely one of the best tie-in games ever. We've had many platformers on the list, but there was never any question that Bruce Lee was going to top the lot of them. I've loved the hell out of this early Datasoft game from the first moment I played it. I suppose it is kind of like Frankie in a way. Rather than just a movie or whatever, you have quite a famous person to deal with, and you have to basically capture their essence. And this small collection of pixels that you're moving along, weirdly enough, actually do feel like you're playing as Bruce Lee, with all the acrobats and ass kickery that you need. Combine that with a wonderfully constructed game design filled with very memorable sequences for the time, and you've got a game that really I find it very hard to find any fault at all with. Almost as legendary as the great man it's based off of. The race for number one then, and my god was it close. Closer than any other list maybe. Two games for me utterly define the C64 more than any other, way ahead of the rest of the pack. In the end, Archer McLean's IK Plus is number 2, and could very easily have been number 1. It's far more than just the addition of a third player to the mix, although that sure does help. Archer never quite understood why fighting should stop fully if someone got knocked down, and adding the third man was his solution, ensuring that there's always something going on, and making IK Plus a furious flurry of flipping and fists of fury. You've got the beautiful surroundings, Rob Hubbard music, and the fun minigames too, of course, but something about IK Plus's organised chaos is perfect, and it kinda just becomes zen. I can easily put an hour or more into IK Plus, simply playing it over and over, endlessly restarting upon defeat, and not even realising just where the time's gone. That's no mean feat for someone as easily distracted as I am. It just takes over, really. Again, there's almost nothing separating this from the top spot. This isn't just one of my favourite C64 games, it's one of my favourite games full stop. And obviously that statement also applies to the number 1 game, which is Sensible Software's Whizball. Much like IK Plus, I can just sit and screw around in Whizball for a long time without really thinking about anything else at all, which is the main thing you really want out of a game, I suppose. So why did this get number 1 and not IK Plus? It was tough, but it came down to this. When I look at the building blocks of Whizball, I kind of have to stand in awe of it, of the creativity that went into it all. You start with a shoot 'em up that's something similar to Defender, you add a bit of Gradius with the power-up system, and then you just go off. A ship you can barely control in the beginning, a world you have to bring the colour back into, a satellite that's also a cat which collects the drops of paint that you need, psychedelic bonus areas, the feeling almost of building the game as you're playing it. It's like, how the hell did John Hare and Chris Yates come up with all of this? It's gotten to the point that when I think about their creative genius, this is almost the first thing that springs to mind. Yes, even over Sensible Soccer. It's that much of a perfect example of just how great their songwriting-esque iteration on a simple formula can be. And of course, when you're actually playing it, none of these things need to come to mind. All of these flourishes, from the more traditional arcade touches to the utterly exotic places they go into, just come naturally. It's just what happens when you play Whizball. It comes together into a package that is, for me, honestly, perfect. I cannot fault Whizball at all. Even if you might find the game's initial lack of control kind of annoying, it's unquestionably exactly what the duo behind it wanted to do. It's totally justified. It's so bold and yet so appealing. Honestly, it's an endless inspiration, a love letter to everything beautiful about game design, and one of the best games we've ever seen. And that's why it gets the #1 spot. So, there's not much to say except to leave you with its unique wonder. Hopefully you've enjoyed this list of my own favourite C64 gems. Bye for now. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you like it, maybe you want to click that thumbs up, click that subscribe, click that notification bell and all that other YouTuber shit. Maybe you want to have a look at my Twitch because I'm generally streaming there quite a lot, or even look at my Patreon and other social media. Who knows, maybe you could join this list of awesome people right here. Alexa Jones Gonzalez, Andrew Dalton, Arcade LY Webmaster, Brian Henniger, Chris, Conrad Pritchard, D. Xalior Rimon Suter, Dagorath Dungeon Keeper, Danny Wolfers, David Rose, Dinty76538, Dustin Cooper, Gary Samaden, Glunthef, J.S. Manchild, James Brown, Jace Alexander, Jeff Ladd, Lucas Kuligovsky, Kid Cassette, Mateus Granzov, Mike Clayton, Martin Pataki, Nate Milbank, Piotr Margel, Renbimon, Robert De Felice, Rod B, Rusty Kelly, Sam Stoddart, Seth A. Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stuart Christopher Brownlee, Tariq Amir, Tim Wald, Tom K, Yerk Operator, and to all the rest of the awesome, wonderful, lovely community. Thank you so much, and goodbye.